Hello, my name is Kevin Danikowski, and today we're going over behaviorism. So first, behaviorism is a learning theory, which is the second force of psychology. Do you remember what the first force is? The first force of psychology is psychoanalysis, but back to behaviorism. Behaviorism began with John Watson in the early 1900s, who claimed that humans have no free will, and we are thus a blank slate or tabula rasa when we're born. Do you agree with this? Well, of course not. How would it explain instincts or reflexes or other complex behaviors you don't learn by association? Behaviorism argues this blank slate assumption of knowing nothing at birth. As Watson famously said, "Give me a child and I'll give you a man of any career, doctor, lawyer, whatever." Now, Skinner, who's known for operant conditioning, argued that this sort of stimuli response dictates complex human behavior like language. Now, who had a problem with this? Well, none other than language theorist Noam Chomsky. Chomsky's famous for obliterating Skinner's argument for this operant conditioning origin of language. Chomsky's argument basically stated the flaws of the behaviorist approach. He argued that Skinner's account was too simplistic and his experiments too unrealistic to account for many of the complex facets of human behavior and cognition, like language, which Chomsky's famous for. Well, neo-behaviorism attempts to solve some of these discrepancies. Neo-behaviorists, the most notable being Clark Hall, said, yes, much of life is dictated by stimuli response. However, some learning does not have obvious reinforcement. He argued that more, even complex information must be taken into account, like your sensory environment, which is called your sensorium. And this must be based on observation. These neo-behaviorism beliefs about subjective experiences worked against the all-or-nothing approach to conditioning, which traditional behaviorists hold. But to fully understand this argument, let's go back to where the second force of psychology really began. Ivan Pavlov, around the early 1900s, wanted to study salivation. He actually had no interest in studying learning. However, after giving the dog food powder to make it salivate, he soon noticed that the dog would salivate when the researcher entered the room. He was able to get the dog to associate food with all sorts of weird random things. Pavlov must have been ecstatic to have this saliva smorgasbord. But anyways, these random things, or stimuli, had to be presented together to make an association. That's why it's called associated learning, such as a bell and food, which Pavlov is famous for. Now, do you recall what the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus and responses were for this situation? The unconditioned stimulus was the food, unconditioned because it didn't need to be learned. The unconditioned response was salivation. You don't need to learn to salivate in response to food. The conditioned stimulus was the bell, a condition involving a new stimulus that you can learn to associate with another. It was conditioned because it's new and later associated. Now, this conditioned stimulus started as a neutral stimulus. And when you go and you pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, you get a conditioned response, which in this case was salivation. Now, please take note that the conditioned response will always be the same as the unconditioned response. The responses are the same. Now, you know this as classical conditioning. Sometimes you might hear it as higher order or second order conditioning. And it is itself a preparation for an expectation, like how you turn away in preparation of being hit by that one kid nobody liked in grade school. This can also explain some fetishes, such as when you're in your highest point of sexual arousal. Then all of a sudden, you look to the side of the bed and see a shoe. You soon begin to associate your climax with shoes, maybe even specific shoes, like heels for those rough times and slippers for the times when you're half awake, but still aroused enough to keep going. Now, the perfect example of classical conditioning is the Little Albert experiment. This partly unethical experiment by Dr. John Watson, mentioned earlier, involved presenting a white rat to 9-month-old boy Albert. At the second encounter with the rat, the researchers waited for Albert to touch the rat. Then, bang! Clanged a pipe and hammer together, making Albert cry. In subsequent encounters, he cried and turned away from not just the rat, but also other white furred objects, including a white fur coat. This response to all white furry things is called stimulus generalization. Thus, the response is generalized to many stimuli, whereas the response to only specific stimuli is dubbed stimulus discrimination, because you can discriminate it from all the other stimuli. Albert sadly died at the age of 6 of hydroencephalus, which may or may not have been caused by the experiment. When Dr. John Watson was asked about this, he just responded, "I don't always scare babies, but when I do, it's for psychology." Those two experiments involving little innocent Albert and the dog are called forward conditioning, presenting the conditioned stimulus with or before the unconditioned stimulus, thus in a forward manner. Do you remember the two main types of forward conditioning? Well, first, we have trace conditioning. This is the one that you usually think of. Trace conditioning is the conditioned stimulus, and then a break, and then the unconditioned stimulus, like a bell, then a break, and then food. Now, delayed conditioning, the second type of forward conditioning, involves presenting the conditioned stimulus before the unconditioned stimulus, like we just said, but then it continues during the unconditioned stimulus. For example, giving Albert the white rat, then leaving it on his lap while you clang the hammer and pipe while he cries. Basically, delayed conditioning is both trace conditioning followed by simultaneous conditioning, which, to no surprise, involves the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus presented, you guessed it, simultaneously, like when you're reaching climax while oogling that shoe in the corner. Now, what's the opposite of forward conditioning? Well, it would have to be, you guessed it again, backwards conditioning, which is the unconditioned stimulus, and then a break, and then conditioned stimulus. This is not nearly as effective because you can't prepare for something you don't know is coming, which is the point of conditioning. It sucks, so don't train your dog with backwards conditioning. Now next, we have temporal conditioning. Why do you think it's called temporal? Because it's an attempt to condition a response to a length of time, thus the temporal aspect. For instance, instead of using a rat, you just clang the hammer every 10 minutes until Albert starts crying at every 10-minute interval. Thus, time is the conditioned stimulus for Albert's tears. Now let's talk about some more high-yield conditioning, aversive conditioning. Aversive conditioning is doing any behavior to avoid a noxious or aversive stimuli, such as when Albert tried turning away pretending the rat wasn't there. Something people do in life all the time. You know, if I don't see it, well, then it can't exist. Like global warming or maybe your credit card debt. Now, there are two main types of aversive conditioning outlined in Richard Solomon's shuttle box experiment. This is different than the Solomon and the conformity experiments. A dog was put in one of two connected boxes. When the shock grid on the floor was turned on, the dog instantly jumped to the second box. The dog was escaping an existing stimuli. This was escape conditioning because the response is after the stimulus, which was the shock. Later, a beep was played just before the shock, and what do you know? The dog learned to move after the beep. The beep told it to avoid what is coming, which was the shock. This is avoidance conditioning because a stimulus was given before the noxious stimulus. Note that the escape and avoidance conditioning are sometimes called escape and avoidance learning. So you can learn to escape the shock or avoid the upcoming shock. Here are some simple but high-yield terms to know for classical conditioning. At the beginning of our conditioning journey, you have your acquisition period, which is just the period when the creature begins to make an association between the two stimuli. So it's just the acquisition of the conditioned response. After acquisition, however, you might stop presenting the stimuli together like the bell and food. This would result in extinction of the response. Extinction involves an extinguished response to the conditioned stimuli, like ringing the bell without presenting the food. Every time you do this, your dog will stop responding to the bell by salivating because it will lose that association you created. Or not seeing shoes while you're reaching climax might get rid of your shoe fetish. It's the same concept. If the stimulus was good, extinction may result in extinction burst, a response spike when reinforcement decreases. A perfect example of extinction burst was when I was at the restaurant this week. The parents behind me told their daughter that she couldn't get any chocolate milk because she had candy earlier that day. I expected her to start crying, but instead she goes, "Please, please, 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 please." As if saying please the 30th time is going to help because it usually helps the first time. Or, for instance, your computer program freezes. So you think to yourself, well, hitting the escape key usually stops the program in other circumstances. So maybe if I hit it another 20 or 30 times, it might finally work again. Thus, your conditioned response increases when the unconditioned stimulus never shows up. That's extinction burst. After extinction, a pairing of the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus again may result in the spontaneous recovery of that conditioned response. This can happen even just a few hours later. Now, we have a special term in psychology for extinction, spontaneous recovery, and acquisition that happens a second time. Do you know what it's called? Well, in psychology, we call it second extinction, second spontaneous recovery, or reacquisition. Nothing surprising. Isn't psychology great? But the real question I've been wondering is, why is Pavlov's dog's hair so soft? I believe he said something like classical conditioning, but I could be wrong. Now, please note that extinction is distinct from habituation. Extinction is the reduction in response to a conditioned stimulus relating to associated learning. And remember, conditioning is associated learning. Habituation, for example, is no longer responding to a beeping noise in the hospital. It is the reduction in response to a non-associated learning. Ah! See, you were startled by the first yell, but not to the second. If you were startled every single time you heard a clock tick without being habituated, you would have a really sad and annoying life. This is habituation. Now, dishabituation, on the other hand, is, of course, the opposite of habituation. Dishabituation is beginning to respond to that stimuli, okay? You're responding when you dishabituate. Lastly, part of non-associated learning is sensitization. Sensitization is increasing the responsiveness to said stimuli. Thus, you're being sensitized to it. Robert Scola disagreed with Pavlov's idea for the simplicity of classical conditioning, and thus created the Scola contingency model. The Scola contingency model states that the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus pairing depends on the contingency between the two. What does that even mean? Whether the conditioned stimulus, the bell, seems like it would predict the unconditioned stimulus, the food. Do they logically relate? Does it make sense that the bell would then predict the food? There is a contingency between the two. This would then depend on timing, the intensity, the stimulus, etc. Low-yield terms here that you should note are excitatory and inhibitory conditioning, such as stimuli increasing salivation for excitatory conditioning or decreasing salivation for inhibitory conditioning. But these are low-yield terms, so don't worry too much. Edward Thorndike later created the law of effect. Seeing as classical conditioning wasn't sufficient to explain human behavior, I mean, what psychological theory really can do this anyways? Thorndike noticed that cats trapped in a box while there was fish on the outside of the box would do a bunch of random behaviors until realizing the box would open by the lever. Thus, this beneficial lever-pressing behavior began, over successive trials, to be selected for. This selection bore the law of effect, which states behaviors with good consequences, such as pressing the lever to get the fish, are likely to be repeated. This was the main influence by works of B.F. Skinner, who pioneered operant conditioning, which you should also know is called instrumental conditioning. Operant and instrumental conditioning are the same. Skinner's studies involved a Skinner box, which is a puzzle box like Thorndike's, and also involved mechanisms of positive and negative punishment and reinforcements, such as levers, shock grids, food dispensaries, the works. Reinforcement is any reward which would increase the behavior, such as food in the case of positive reinforcement, and the cessation of nagging you to take out the trash in the case of negative reinforcement. Punishment, on the other hand, is any reprimand which would decrease a behavior, such as work hours in the case of positive punishment, or your girlfriend refusing to have sex in the case of negative punishment, also called omission training. Negative punishment is omission training. Now, reinforcers come in multiple flavors. You got your chocolate reinforcers, you got your glazed donut reinforcers, your cherry pie reinforcers. I'm just kidding. You have your primary reinforcers, which are your innate wishes, like food or sex, whereas your secondary reinforcers are taught to be meaningful. A secondary reinforcer would be grades or maybe money. Then you also have your condition reinforcers, and these are exactly what you would expect. You're conditioned to do something. For instance, a conditioned stimuli like a bell in relation to food. And then lastly, I want to talk about generalized reinforcers. Generalized reinforcers are ones that basically everybody can use, such as money, for instance. Now, notice that there could be an overlap with how we categorize them. For instance, money was both a secondary and a generalized reinforcer. Now, reinforcers can be given in multiple reinforcement schedules. I'll list them and then I'll go over them. So we have your fixed ratio, your variable interval, and your fixed interval. Ratios depend on how many times you have to do the behavior until you get a reward. Like you have to do 10 chores per quarter you get, a perfect example of why we have child labor laws. Whereas intervals are based on time, like paying hourly wages in 15-minute working intervals. Now, which schedules do you think would produce the highest rate of response? It would have to be a schedule with a reward based on the number of times you do the task, like chores. Thus, high response rates are seen in fixed ratio and variable ratio. That's really high yield. Now, imagine working out, maybe running on a treadmill. Most of the time, you're probably thinking, wow, this sucks. Maybe having this extra 50 pounds isn't that big of a deal. I can't wait to get home and just destroy some peanut butter. Then all of a sudden, you look down and you see the clock is 10 seconds left. You kick it into overdrive thinking, I'm working so hard, I'm killing it. This is because fixed interval schedules have large increases in response at the end of the interval. Now, the last schedule that we should note is variable interval. Variable interval has a low response throughout, but the key point here is variable interval is the most resistant to extinction. If you wanted to get your child to start doing a task for you, you should reinforce it right away, like grabbing you a beer. You would do well to use continuous reinforcement, which uses a fixed ratio of 1-to-1. Okay, every time they give you a beer, you give them a piece of candy. Now, if you wanted to make sure they do this for a very long time and it's not extinct, you would do well to not give them candy every time. What do I mean? You should use the partial reinforcement effect. The partial reinforcement effect states that an act is more resistant to extinction when every response is not reinforced. For instance, you might go to a slot machine and play it if it's got an average win every 30 tries, and you keep playing as long as you have money. Whereas if the reward was every other try, then you would stop playing as soon as you lost interest because you knew every other one was going to be a win. When attempting to condition animals, one should keep in mind a few things. First, if you want a dog to dance, you must reinforce some increment of that behavior called shaping until the dog develops some sort of rhythm to say, who let the dogs out? If you waited to reinforce until the dog did a dance move, you won't be very successful. This may also involve chaining multiple movements together before giving the pet a reward. In addition to shaping and chaining, you should keep in mind the Premack principle. The Premack principle states that likely behaviors done after unlikely behaviors will reinforce that unlikely behavior. For instance, if rats are hungry, they're more likely to press a lever which dispenses food, making the unlikely lever pressing behavior more probable. Or, for instance, you probably had your parents tell you you must eat broccoli before you can have your ice cream. You were unlikely to eat your broccoli, but you were likely to eat your ice cream. So requiring the unlikely behavior of broccoli eating first, it reinforced the unlikely broccoli eating behavior. For the Premack principle, just think that you need to be hungry before you're willing to indulge in that repugnant Big Mac. Finally, instinctive drift is when the animal's conditioned response begins to fade as it reverts back to its instinctual behavior. For instance, remember that dog you taught to dance to Who Let the Dogs Out? Now, When you present it with food, all you get is this puzzled face and an occasional bark, thus reverting to its instinct when you present it with food, or it might even bite you, for instance. So remember, when conditioning animals, keep in mind shaping, chaining, Premack principle, and instinctive drift. Now let's discuss counterconditioning, which is making an undesirable response to a conditioned stimulus more desirable. For instance, one of Watson's students treated a 3-year-old's fear of rabbits by giving him his favorite food, like ice cream, every time the rabbit was presented, thus creating a new conditioned response. So what it's doing is, for instance, in this example, taking the fear associated with rabbits, and by giving ice cream, you're making happiness associated with rabbits. This is counterconditioning. This can also be done to make a pleasurable act, such as smoking, less desirable. Now, the common form to cure the fear of things is systemic desensitization, which uses relaxation or other coping mechanisms to calm the fear, such as that 3-year-old's fear of rabbits. Now, there's 2 main types. Do you remember them? Well, first, we have in vivo desensitization, a type of exposure therapy which involves gradually presenting real-life exposure of that scenario. For instance, let's say you had a fear of talking with women. So the first day, you talk with 1 woman, and then the second day, 2 women, and then the next day, 3, and then before you know it, you have so many numbers you can't even count. Now, this differs from flooding, which involves presenting the stimulus for a long duration in person or via image to hopefully curb the fear, such as being thrown into a room full of women. What a horrible experience that would be. But be warned, flooding can be dangerous and has caused panic attacks and hospitalization, so consult your physician before use. The next type is covert desensitization. Covert desensitization is also called, at times, in vitro or imaginal desensitization. It involves thinking about the fear or presenting pictures. So covert desensitization is a form of implosive therapy if you're only using your mind to conquer it, such as the nature of implosive therapy. Think about it, covertly entering the mind and imploding it. Now let's wrap it up. The main players in behaviorism are Pavlov, Skinner, Thorndike, and Watson. Behaviorism is based on classical and operant conditioning, arguing our lives are based off of stimuli response. There are multiple other forms of conditioning which you should know, such as counter-conditioning just mentioned, or forward and backward conditioning. And finally, for operant conditioning, there are multiple types of reinforcement and multiple schedules which can affect the likelihood of a response and its resistance to extinction. Thank you all. Join me